wanted to take a minute to remind ourselves about that logic model tool and what we would see or expect to see in those bins. I've looked over the models. I'm in the process of grading. I'm just a little uncertain if everyone's clear on how these logic models function. We're making progress, certainly, and there were some great looking ideas and models, but I just want to reiterate how this may be used and put together. Certainly you can adjust it, include a customer bin, use some of these ideas in your own way, because there's not really a right or wrong way to do a logic model. I just wanted to clarify to try and make it a simpler idea for you, and really helping you organize what your ideas are and your strategies and with regard to your research or other activities. So just a quick review. We talked about those resources that go into it. That may be funding, that may be some types of human capital, that may be some educational materials, etc. Activities, those are the activities that we are going to do with those resources, or the people that are involved with those in the resources with the activities. So conducting research, holding workshops, developing education material, doing community outreach, etc. Some of the outputs here, we start to try and come up with some of those measures or metrics and what we are actually having as a output from the activity. Number of people at those workshops, number of legislators contacted perhaps, if we're talking about policy, number of clients served, etc. So you're able to quantitatively understand how you're making progress with those activities in the customers or the stakeholder, the participant groups you are looking to affect. Okay, then some of those short-term outcomes, and this is one I think we have a little bit of confusion on. The short-term outcomes, well, on rare occasion you may get that immediate change in behavior, like with something with policy, but even with that, over time, it still requires kind of implementation of that policy. So when we're talking about short-term changes, we're talking about changes in knowledge, maybe some skills they're developing, a better understanding of the topic that we're interested in, attitudes, etc. Then intermediate outcomes, that's where we start to see those changes in behaviors, where, yes, the parents are not only using those car seats on a regular basis or continually, but also installing those car seats properly. So longer term, the change of environment, certainly that would be where we're seeing that reduction in injuries, but it would also be where we're seeing that cultural acceptance that it's the norm to use those car seats and be able to properly install them as a parent or caregiver for those children. So just a little reminder again, when you're putting together your logic model, or if you decide to work with a logic model, that left to right if-then statement, looking at the continuity between your ideas. And again, check all of the things that you're listing in those bins, because there were a few that, yes, they may be appropriate, but I'm not so sure that they flowed in that bin particularly. And other items, I just wasn't really certain how they fit within the area of interest. So a little review on that. The problem statement, this is another one I think I assumed this was something you'd had a good background in, and some of you obviously have, but I should have maybe reiterated or given a little better context for that assignment. And that was part of what I was trying to do with the assignment. I added it prior to the outline so I could understand where we were at with this concept. What I got from many of you was maybe more of an environmental scan or a literature review or beginning of a literature review on a topic. And that's really not the problem statement. The problem statement would advise or direct that environmental scan and literature review, and certainly you would do some portion of that ahead of any type of action on the problem statement. But the problem statement is a persuasive context for research goals. It's explaining, and we've talked about this, explaining to your clients or your audience, if it's for your dissertation proposal, for instance, why your research is needed. So the basic structure, really this can be done, it can be more than 3 sentences, but just to simply go through what this should contain in a 3-sentence structure. The first sentence should describe that goal, state, or value that the client considers important and relevant to the problem. Here we talk about the car seat use or proper car seat use. Second would be that conjunction. Okay, so that's where we want to be, but what's preventing us from getting there? Why haven't we gotten to that, for instance, vision 0, or that state where we want to get to? That's a little broader than anything we would be looking at, but again, concept-wise. And then finally, we want to explain to them very directly, concisely what we plan to do. Certainly we'll expand on that, but we want to give them kind of a basic lead into our topic so they're going to understand where we're taking them with our research. An example, the Centers for Disease Control recommends rear-facing infant car seats for all children under 2 years. However, crash reports, and this would be our conjunction connected to the condition, crash reports show that use rate is below 70%. So obviously, a condition that we're looking at, the use rate is below 70%. So what do we plan to do? So very simply, and again, we'd expand on this in the document, but in just trying to introduce the topic, crash reports will be studied to identify at-need populations in terms of location and driver age, to better focus local policy, education, and enforcement efforts, very simply. So that, what I was looking for was just a simple short paragraph with your problem statement. And so, again, some of you had a good understanding of this. Others maybe were a little less clear on the problem statement idea. So I have included then an update to that. I'll certainly go through and try and give you some feedback on your assignments, but I've included just an update, and I really want a 3-sentence problem statement at the front end of your outline in this next assignment. If you have questions about that, or if you think it needs to go a sentence or two beyond that, that's fine. But what we're looking for is a very concise statement about where the issue and where you plan to go with your topic to inform that issue. Okay, and then I also just wanted to share a follow-up on an example of that logic model, given my follow-up today on what should be in those bins. Talking about the inputs, the DOT funding, Department of Health funding, experts, all those type of resources would fall into the inputs for us. The activities that would come out of that, some of the research, child protection system training, they also have clinics, high visibility enforcement perhaps. And then we want to look at, from those activities, what are some of our outcomes? For instance, number of occupant systems inspected, number of parents educated, number of nurses contacted, number of car seats, be they free or partially paid, distributed, number of officers trained, just ideas you could put in that box. And then some of our short-term gains or outcomes. Parent knowledge increases. Nurses' attitudes are more receptive towards doing some of that introduction to car seats. Law enforcement is more confident in their ability to confirm that the caregiver is using that proper car seat. Then intermediate term outcomes, that's when we start to see some of those actionable items. Rear-facing car seat use increases for that interest or that group at interest. The car protection, seat protection, issue there with the spelling. Advice from nurses expands, community support grows, enforcement is regularly doing that, checking for compliance. So the longer term ultimate goals, of course, infant injury and death and motor vehicle crashes decline, and preventative behaviors with regard to the infant car seats are the cultural norm. That's just to be expected. If you're a parent or caregiver, you have that knowledge, or you're getting that knowledge as a preventative measure. Some context we'd want to consider if we're looking at the progress that we're making over time, infant populations, the population levels, the technician locations and number of technicians, young family locations, policies that may be in place. And again, we look at those initially, and those certainly could change over time. So I thought this may be useful in framing your own topics, and if you have any questions with regard to what I've suggested here, please just let me know, and I can certainly, we can set up a little time for a meeting. So now moving into this week's new material, I'm going to cover this fairly quickly. I'll just direct you towards the reading materials and your outline assignment for this week, as well as wrapping up your team assignment. And again, I'm out this week with travel and training, but if you need something, certainly feel free to email me, or we can get together. I will be in the office a couple of days next week and can make time for meeting with you at that point. So this week we're going to look at the system level safety management and implementing road safety, and also some performance measurement in the holy text. System-wide is a general term that refers to treating safety issues across the entire transportation system. For instance, using a policy to discuss seatbelt use, that would be system-wide. Something that may happen with driver's licensing or police vehicle policing may also be involved. But then we also have the systematic, which is a more specific term in our presentation from the federal highway expert, refers to identifying a subset within that transportation system based on risk factors and implementing the safety efforts that address that particular characteristic. So the system is determined by the jurisdictional boundaries, so that makes a big difference if you're talking at state boundaries, community boundaries, neighborhood boundaries, etc. It is important when we're getting into these issues, we talk about system level management, is that process of addressing and identifying safety issues that affect the population or the driving population at a broad level. So we need to identify that safety problem with that system level risk, a widespread issue, perhaps some crash type trends such as risky behaviors or at-risk populations, and be specific when you're talking about those issues and what you see as a problem. So examples of problem identification, the strategic highway safety plans are a framework for coordinated efforts to reduce traffic injuries on public roadways. They're certainly some examples. That's an example of a problem identification where we saw there they looked at 5 years of crash records, serious injury crashes, to understand what their emphasis or priorities would be with regard to system-wide improving what the traffic safety might be. Those actual actionable items may be systematic or maybe site level, but looking at it from a broader, more organizational, broad organization, multidisciplinary type of perspective, they want to look at more broadly at all issues. The USDOT does provide, if you want to go ahead and take a look at some of the other states' SHSPs, could potentially be a research project in itself there, trying to understand what some peers are done, looking where they've had some success in areas that perhaps North Dakota hasn't, and vice versa. Moving on to communities may also go through a similar process. I believe one of the proposals talked about something that's going on right now in Fargo with regard to walkability, bikeability type of active transport priorities. There are other methods that you can use in looking at communities perhaps than you could looking state level. So keep that in mind, gives you a little bit broader array of methods that you might want to look at. And then data and organizational capital factors should certainly be considered in determining the problem identification method. What do you have to work with when you're looking at the issue? While the state may have $100,000, a community may only have $3,000, or it may be all volunteer. So again, understanding what and determining that ahead of laying out your plan for the problem. Problem prioritization, system level problem prioritization, such as the SHSP emphasis areas, is important in safety management. The systematic approach has been recognized as a proactive and efficient approach to safety. You're trying to direct those resources where they are most needed rather than applying to the entire system. We talked about North Dakota working on rumble strips on this at the state system, and they initially started out system level. They were going to put rumble strips on every road in North Dakota. As they've learned more and begun to refine the process, and now they're looking at just treatment at those particular sites or on those particular roads where it seems appropriate rather than system-wide, because when they use those type of treatments, it has other implications for the road life and the maintenance costs and et cetera. So needing to balance those issues. The systematic approach is based in risk and risk-based prioritization. Data and organizational capital are, of course, factors in devising a strategy to prioritize those traffic safety problems. When we're looking at selecting a traffic safety strategy, different stakeholder groups have different perspectives. Keeping that in mind, there's local and state perspectives, which certainly are not always in agreement. Safety and economic, things like pedestrian and passenger vehicle drivers, large truck drivers and other drivers, etc. Engineering behavior, keeping those things in mind as you're looking at strategies and how they may best be approached with regard to your particular issue or problem. Multidisciplinary strategies that they talked about, such as the high pole crashes at 2 a.m. Solutions. Was there other solutions that they had beyond the high visibility enforcement? Was there something they could do with driver education? Was there something they could do perhaps with server education, alternative rides, etc.? When's another time we might see something this pole, this spike in crashes? I know, and you all probably have your own examples and what you've looked at so far, but things like rush hour, another one when you're looking at teen drivers, certainly that before school, after school time period. So just keeping in mind the context that you're looking at and some of the maybe strategies that when you're looking at effective strategies, what you may need to do to understand the solution, or select the strategy, I should say. Critical thinking for those effective solutions, again, making sure that the solution you're offering or the strategy you're offering is appropriate for the issue that you have or the scope of the issue that you have. So is the information sufficient that you have now? If not, what else is needed? Should you do some cross-tabulation like they did with time in the previous example? Or should you do something maybe looking at driver age within an issue? Should subsets be used? Should be looking at different areas in the state or different areas in the city? Some stepwise assessment, of course, you make progress, see what that produces. You see some of those decision trees that they include in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, and if you follow those through, you get some insight there on some of the crash factors and contributing factors. Continue the analysis and persist until all the information or until the accessible information is exhausted. And if in the end that countermeasure just turns out not to be appropriate, the cost turns out to be larger than the benefit, or if you revisit it and find out that is the case, it's time to go back and go through that process again and start to look at other opportunities for strategies. An example they gave were some of the NHTSA proven countermeasures, and I just laid out some of the topics in this, as I know some of you have already selected ideas in these areas. They give you some information about the effectiveness of the different strategies, where it lies on the cost, and most of the ones that I would expect you to be looking at are at the single dollar sign, what the use is, and then also when you should see those results, short or medium term kind of outcomes. The Federal Highway Proven Safety Strategies, we also looked at that, and Federal Highway included some of that information. The webinar we viewed, the guide for this one includes strategies, a cost assessment for those, and then again that effectiveness kind of judgment on if you're going to see some real impacts from using those countermeasures. So those resources are both within the Blackboard resource module for the course. If you have any questions on those, please just let me know. Implementing strategies, communication is a key, especially for those system level strategies or safety strategies. We can go back to the rumble strip example. When they first started installing those rumble strips, drivers were extremely annoyed. They didn't understand why the rumble strips were there. All they saw was a inconvenience with regard to the noise. And that would say that they were hitting the edge of the road, so it was probably actually helping them. But after they did or began to do some public education and explain to people why they were doing the rumble strips, and people began to have their own experiences and share those experiences with lawmakers and with people in the traffic safety realm, then the rumble strips gradually are more widely accepted by the public as a safety feature rather than an annoyance. So just keeping in mind that when we're talking about stakeholders with regard to your proposal, you want to include not only the people that might help implement that strategy, but also the people that you would be impacting or touching or affecting with that strategy. Also, key elements within what we might be looking at for strategy, cost efficiency, and looking at that cost efficiency, yes, benefits greater than cost, but also within what you have available for resources, which is often a challenge. Implementing road safety efforts, just a description here of some of the things that you might want to go through, description of the agency roles, and again, a resource for you really with the materials they cover in that chapter, but I think it's pretty thorough, and we've touched on some of it. If you have additional follow-up you need on that, please let me know. The Holy text just provides an introduction into some performance measures. The car seat use, for instance, use of a car seat inspection site, outcomes, is the program producing the intended results, or perhaps the parents are just collecting those car seats and reselling them for cash. So again, trying to make sure that what you're tracking is truly showing that the outcome is producing the intended results. Cost effectiveness, that you could look at that in different ways, relation to an outcome, for instance, the dollars it costs per car seat inspection or the time involved per car seat inspection. All those things can be considered as kind of quantitative follow-up to a strategy to understand how you are doing with that strategy. Other things you could do are customer surveys, perhaps an exit survey or a follow-up survey via postcard. Service quality is something else that agencies often look at. For instance, the Department of Motor Vehicles tries to collect some information on customer satisfaction, waiting time, safety, et cetera, when they work with the general public. Okay, and just following up here with a few items on converting that performance data into information. Trends, we've looked at trends already in class. I know many of you are using those in the background material you provided for your topics, and in some of the assignments we've already had. You could also use benchmarks, use some benchmark year, for instance, and see where you would like to be in 20 years. That's something that the Vision Zero does. Also, the Strategic Highway Safety Plan does some of that in setting targets in the Highway Safety Plan. There may be a unit comparison or some external benchmarking. A major purpose of a performance measure is to raise questions. It seldom provides the answer about what should be done. Again, it is that item those items you can go back to understand if and how your strategy is working, or what you perhaps need to refine or replace with regard to strategies. Some success hints they gave were results-driven outcomes rather than data-driven. Stakeholder buy-in, we've talked about that. Use constructively and not punitively when you're presenting how the findings might be used or how this information may be used. Don't represent things. If it's not going as you had intended, just state that and try and explain perhaps the unintended consequences. State your assumptions, and then also do set up something where you're getting that periodic or institutionalized review. Otherwise, when we try something new and it's just, you see the cases all the time when people say, well, why is it being done that way? And they say, well, just because it's always been done that way. Well, if that's working, wonderful. If not, it's time to revisit. Okay, briefly on assignments. Review those readings and resources prior to participating in the discussion. I did put a sample in the resources for you to look at with regard to a problem statement and outline. I thought that may give you some guidance on what we're expecting with this next assignment. Again, you're welcome to expand it beyond that. What I was trying to give you was a basic framework for that. It's based not exactly, but on these items that I've included here is an outline. So just draw on both those, and you certainly have flexibility in naming your own sections and how you want to organize, but I want to make sure that you're covering all these aspects of what should be included in your proposal. So no weekly discussion this week. I know this is a very important assignment, so we're going to continue this one, and we also have that ongoing team assignment. Keep in mind that full proposal, draft proposal, is due in about a month. So I just want to, I'm hoping if we get a good start with these outlines, it's going to get you started on the right road, and therefore no wasting of time, and you can make good progress on those projects. So I thank you for your time, and I will, I think, set up a meeting for the class on October 10th. I'm coming back into town on an early flight that day and hoping I can get back for a 1 p.m. class meeting. In the meantime, again, feel free to contact me via email, and I will